The wind found Anna Lee first. It came screaming off the high plains like a blade, carrying the taste of iron and ice. And it was the only welcome she got. The stagecoach, 6 hours behind schedule and rattling with impatience, had left her on the roadside 3 miles from the marker. The driver hadn't liked her silence. Or maybe he'd just seen the end of her money. He'd pointed into the gray gloom and spat. "Hart's place is over that rise, if you run." She did not run, she walked. Each step was a small death. Her city boots, made for the boardwalks of St. Louis, were shredded. Her coat was fashionable but thin, a useless defense against the Wyoming territory. She was a creature of silk and porcelain set down in a world of rock and claw. By the time she saw the ranch house, she was sobbing, but the wind tore the sound from her mouth before she could even hear it. The house was not a home. It was a scar, a low-slung cabin of dark, weathered pine, hunkered against a bluff as if trying to hide from the sky. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light shone in the single, dark window. For a terrible moment, Anna thought it was abandoned, that she had come all this way to die on a stranger's empty doorstep. She hauled herself up the 3 rickety steps and knocked. Her knuckles felt like brittle twigs against the solid wood. Nothing. She knocked again, harder, using the last of her strength to beat against the door. "Please," she whispered, a prayer to a God who had long since turned his face away. A sound came from within, a heavy boot scraping on a wooden floor, a bolt being drawn, a sound like a rifle being cocked. The door opened 6 inches. The man who stood in the gap was built of the same material as the land. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and looked as if he had been carved from seasoned oak. His hair was dark, his beard untrimmed, and his eyes, they were the color of the sky just before the snow, a flat, unforgiving gray. He held a Winchester rifle in the crook of his arm, its muzzle pointed at the floor but ready. He just stared. He didn't speak. "Mr. Hart?" Anna's voice was a dry croak. "Silas Hart?" The man's eyes narrowed. He looked past her, into the howling storm, as if expecting to see someone else. A threat. "Who's asking?" His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "I am Anna Lee, from St. Louis." She fumbled inside her thin coat, her fingers numb, stiff as wood. She pulled out a damp, folded letter. I am the bride." Silas Hart looked at the letter, then at her face, and his expression did not change. But a new kind of cold entered his eyes, a suspicion so sharp it was worse than the wind. He clearly thought this was a trick, some new way for the world to try and fool him. "I don't know you," he said. "It's all here." She pushed the letter at him. "The contract. From the Matrimonial Bureau. It's signed." He didn't take it. He just looked at the name stamped on the envelope. Then, a dark understanding washed over his face. It was not relief. It was a deep, settled anger that seemed to sink him deeper into the earth. He let out a slow breath, not of surprise, but of tired recognition. "Elias," he said, so low she almost missed it. He was speaking to himself. "That damn fool." He looked back at Anna, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the torn dress, the ruined boots, the blue tint of her lips. He saw a problem, nothing more. "He had no right," Silas said. He wasn't talking to her, but to the wind. "Sir?" He finally looked at her, truly looked, and his face was a mask of iron. "My brother, Elias, he's a meddler with a soft head. I never sent for a wife. I don't want a wife." Anna Lee felt the ground drop away. This was it, the last door, and it was closing. The stage was gone. The town was miles away. The wind was a solid wall of ice. She had nowhere left on earth to go. She did not plead. She did not cry. She simply lowered her hand. The letter still clutched in it, and a stillness came over her. The stillness of a thing about to break. "I see," she said. She turned to walk away. back down the steps, into the white darkness that was waiting to claim her. She had no plan. She would just walk until she fell. "Get in." The words were not an invitation. They were a command, sharp and cold as a nail. She stopped, her back to him. "Get inside," he said again, his voice laced with a terrible impatience. "The storm's turning. You'll not die on my land." She turned back. He had opened the door wider. He stepped aside, and Anna Lee stumbled past him, out of the wind and into the silence of the Hart Ranch. The door slammed shut, and the sound of the world vanished. All that was left was the heavy, sharp silence of the room. It was one long room, bleak as a monk's cell. The floors were raw pine, scrubbed bare but stained with mud and time. To the left was a cast-iron stove, cold, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a dry sink. To the right, a large, unmade bed built into the far wall, covered in a pile of dark wool blankets and animal pelts. And near the stove, a small, narrow cot. There were no curtains on the window, no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls. There was nothing soft, nothing kind, nothing that spoke of a woman's touch. The only decoration was a rifle rack by the door, holding 2 more guns, and a pair of worn-out boots caked in dry mud. The air smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and something deeper, something like dust and grief. Silas stalked past her, his heavy boots echoing on the planks. He threw a log into the stove and shoved kindling under it. He didn't look at her. "My brother overstepped," Silas said, his back to her as he worked the flint and steel. Sparks flew. "He's in Laramie, thinks he knows what's best for me. He doesn't—" Anna stood by the door, afraid to move, afraid to drip on the floor. Her travel bag, which held every single thing she owned, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I did not know," she whispered. "The letter seemed legal. I paid the broker." "It's not your fault," he said, still not looking at her. The kindling caught, and a small, hungry flame licked at the log. "But it's my problem. You can sleep on the cot tonight. The storm should pass by morning. Then I'll ride to town, see what's to be done about this contract." He meant, see what was to be done about her, how to send her back. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," she said. He grunted. He straightened up, turned, and finally seemed to see her standing there, a ragged ghost in his house. "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm not a kind man. I'm just a man who doesn't want a corpse at his gate." Anna, desperate to fill the awful quiet, tried to cling to the manners she'd been raised with. It's sturdy country you have here, very different from Missouri." Silas picked up a tin coffee pot from the stove, looked inside, and finding it empty, slammed it back down. "Aye. The journey was very long. The stagecoach line is not always reliable. It seems. No." He walked to the dry sink and pumped a dipper of water from a bucket, drinking it straight from the dipper. His movements were spare, efficient, as if he begrudged wasting a single motion. He was a man who lived entirely inside himself, walled off and locked down. Anna saw her bag in her hand. She had a little flour left, some salt, and a paper-wrapped piece of bacon. It was meant for her journey, but the journey was over. She would not be a complete burden. "Mr. Hart," she said, her voice shaking a little. "If I may, I could prepare a meal to thank you for the shelter." He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were flat. "I've got food." "I know, but please, allow me." He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shrug. It was not permission, but he did not forbid it. He sat down at the rough table, in the chair that faced the door, and began cleaning his rifle. He laid the pieces out on an oilcloth, his hands large and scarred, moving with a surgeon's care. Anna Lee moved for the first time. She took off her ruined coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. Her dress, once fine wool, was stained and torn at the hem. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a refugee. She went to the dry sink, washed her hands in the cold basin, and found his provisions. They were as bleak as the rest of the cabin. A sack of flour, a bin of beans, salt pork, coffee, and jerky. Nothing else. She was a good cook. It was one of the few skills she possessed that had any value out here. She built up the fire, found a heavy skillet, and set to work. She made biscuits from the flour and what little lard she found. She fried slices of the salt pork until they were crisp. She put the coffee on to boil. The smells filled the small cabin. Hot iron, salt, and baking bread. It was the smell of a home. Silas never looked up. He just kept cleaning his gun. The click-clack of the metal parts was the only sound that answered the sizzle of the pan. When the food was ready, she served it. She put a tin plate with 3 biscuits and several pieces of pork in front of him. She poured him a cup of the steaming black coffee. She served herself a smaller portion. She sat in the other chair. The silence stretched. "Please eat, Mr. Hart," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's hot." He finished reassembling the rifle, sighted down the clean barrel, and leaned it against the wall by his chair. He looked at the plate. He looked at the steam rising from the biscuits. He looked at her. Then, slowly, he pushed the plate away from him, toward the center of the table. He picked up the coffee cup, drank the hot liquid in 2 long, deep swallows, and set the cup down. He stood up. "I'm not hungry," he said. He walked to the far end of the cabin, to the large bed built into the wall. He took off his boots, but nothing else. He lay down on top of the pile of blankets and turned his face to the wall. Anna Lee sat at the table, alone. The food in front of her grew cold. The man who was supposed to be her husband lay 10 feet away, a silent, breathing wall of rejection. She did not cry. She was too empty for tears. She ate one of the cold biscuits, forcing herself to chew and swallow. It tasted like ash. Hours passed. The fire in the stove burned low, and the cold began to creep back into the room. The wind moaned, a low, grieving sound that never stopped. Silas did not move. His breathing was a deep, even rhythm in the dark. Anna cleaned the plates, stacking them neatly in the dry sink. She had no right to the cot. Not really. It was his, but he had offered. It was just a thin mattress on a rope frame, with one threadbare blanket. It was closer to the stove, but the stove was now just a box of dying embers. She sat on the edge of it, too tired to stand, too afraid to lie down. She looked at the floor. It was hard, cold, but it was honest. She would not take his cot. She was a guest, and an unwanted one at that. She slipped off the cot and sat on the floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest. She leaned her back against the rough-hewn wall next to the stove, where a little warmth still lingered. She untied her travel bag and pulled out her only other dress, wadding it up to use as a pillow. She draped her own thin coat over her legs. The cabin was pitch black now, save for the faint red glow from the stove's grate. The man on the bed was a mountain of shadow. Anna curled into herself, shivering, lost in a darkness deeper than the night. She whispered to no one, to the cold, to the ghost of the life she'd lost. "Where will I sleep?" In the dark, Silas Hart's breathing hitched. Just for a second, he had heard her. He did not move. He did not answer. He just lay there, facing the wall, and let her shiver in the cold. At first light, he was up. Anna hadn't slept, but had drifted in a cold, painful stupor. She woke with a start when his boots hit the floor. The cabin was freezing. He didn't look at her. He moved with that same grim efficiency, pulling on his heavy coat and hat. He shoved jerky into his pocket. "The storm's let up some," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm riding to town to sort this." He went to the door and paused, his hand on the latch. "Don't touch anything." He said it not as a request, but as a threat. "Don't touch my life. Don't disturb the order of my grief." "Yes, Mr. Hart," she said from the floor. The door opened, letting in a blast of blinding white light and frigid air. Then he was gone, and the door was closed, and she was alone. The silence that fell was different. It was not his heavy, angry silence. It was just empty. Anna pushed herself up. Her entire body ached with a deep, bone-cold stiffness. She was a woman who had been raised to do nothing, and now she found she could not bear it. To be still was to let the terror in. She had to move. She broke his rule. She touched everything. She rebuilt the fire, her hands clumsy, but she got it going. She found the coffee and made a pot for herself, drinking it black and bitter. Then she set to work. She washed the dishes from last night and the coffee pot from this morning. She found a bucket and filled it from the indoor pump, heating the water on the stove. She found a rag and scrubbed the tabletop. She found a broom and swept the floor, her movements stiff and awkward, but determined. She was not cleaning for him. She was cleaning for herself. She was drawing a line in the dust and declaring that she was, at least, still alive. She saw the laundry piled in a corner, a pair of denim trousers, a flannel shirt, some heavy wool socks. They smelled of sweat and horse and smoke. She found a bar of lye soap and a washboard in a wooden tub. She heated more water. She washed his clothes. It was hard, brutal work. Her soft hands that had known only embroidery and piano keys, were raw and red in minutes. The lye soap stung, the coarse fabric scraped, and her back screamed. But she kept going. She wrung the clothes out and, finding nowhere else, draped them over the chairs and the table's edge near the fire to dry. The cabin was warmer now. It smelled of soap and damp wool. It was a human smell. As she was sweeping near the large chest at the foot of his bed, her broom hit something tucked underneath. She bent down. She reached into the dust, and her fingers closed on something small and hard. She pulled it out. It was a boot, a child's boot, small enough for a toddler. It was made of soft, reddish-brown leather, with tiny, intricate beading across the toe. It was worn at the heel, as if from a little one learning to walk. Anna stared at it. This was the one thing in the house that was not rough, not plain. It was beautiful. It was loved. She looked around the bleak, empty room. The man who pushed his food away. The man who slept in his clothes. The man who didn't want a wife. She felt a lurch in her chest, a sudden, sharp empathy that cut through her own fear. This was not a house. This was a grave. She gently tucked the little boot back where she had found it, pushing it deep into the darkness. As she worked, the walls of her own past began to close in. The starkness of this place reminded her of the last home she'd had. She remembered her father's study in St. Louis, all dark mahogany and cold leather. He hadn't yelled. He had been quiet, which was so much worse. "Anna Lee," he'd said, not looking at her. "Mr. Cartwright has informed me of your indiscretion. He is, however, still willing to do you the honor of making you his wife, to save your name, to save our name." She remembered Wendell Cartwright, his handsome, laughing face at the cotillion, his hands, which were not gentle, the smell of whiskey on his breath in the carriage, the thing he had done, which everyone called her indiscretion, the thing that had been a violation. "I will not marry him, father," she had said, her voice a thread. "Then you are no daughter of mine." It had been that simple. Her mother had wept behind a closed door. Her brother had looked away. She was given a small bag, a train ticket, and the name of a marriage broker in a town she'd never heard of. Her family had not disowned her for being ruined. They had disowned her for refusing to be silenced by marrying the ruiner. She had been on the road for 3 weeks. She was not a mail-order bride seeking adventure. She was a woman with a noose at her back, and she had just arrived at the gallows. She was scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees when the door opened again. Silas Hart stood there. The wind had whipped his face raw, and snow caked his shoulders. He stopped dead. He stared at the cabin. The floor was clean. The table was scrubbed. His laundry was drying by the fire. The room smelled of soap. He looked at her, on her knees, a wet rag in her hand, her hair falling from its pins. She looked up at him, terrified, like a mouse caught by a hawk. A complex, dark emotion moved in his face. It was not gratitude. It was deeper, more troubled. It was anger, but it was also a profound, unwelcome uneasiness. She had broken the spell. She had let the light into his tomb. He did not know how to live with it. He walked past her, his boots leaving wet tracks on her clean floor. He went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had left warming. He said nothing. Not thank you. Not I told you not to. He sat at the table, moving his drying shirt to the side. He drank his coffee and stared at the far wall. Anna slowly got to her feet. Mr. Hart? The contract? It's binding, he said, his voice flat. The circuit judge says the paper is legal, signed by my brother as proxy. He paid the fee, unless I want to contest it in court, which'll take 6 months and cost more than the ranch is worth. He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were dead. You're my wife, according to the law. Anna felt a strange, cold wave pass through her. She was married to this, but I'm telling you plain, he continued, his voice dropping low. The law's one thing, this house is another. I don't want a wife. I don't need a wife. You can stay till the spring thaw, till the roads are clear. Then I'll give you train fare, and you'll go. Understand? She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Good. He finished his coffee and stood. You can have the cot. He didn't offer her his bed. He just gave her the cot. It was a concession, the first he had made. He did not, however, offer her any of his blankets. That night, she lay on the narrow cot. He lay on his bed. The silence was back, but it was different. It was heavier, freighted with the new, unwanted knowledge that they were tied together. The cold was worse. It settled deep in Anna's chest. She had been strong all day, but the night and the chill and the bone-deep exhaustion broke her. She began to shiver. At first, it was small, a tremble she tried to hide under the single thin blanket, but it grew. Her teeth began to chatter, a violent, rattling sound that filled the dark room. A cough seized her, a dry, hacking sound that tore at her lungs. In the dark, she heard him move. Be quiet, he growled from his bed. I'm trying, she chattered. I'm just so cold. Another hour passed. The shivering didn't stop. It got worse. She was shaking the whole frame of the cot. She felt a strange heat bloom on her forehead, even as her hands and feet turned to ice. She was sick. The journey, the night on the floor, the wind, it had all caught her. She heard a heavy sigh from the darkness, then the scrape of his boots. A match flared, and he lit the oil lamp. His face, in the yellow light, was a mask of pure exasperation. He looked at her, trembling on the cot, her face pale and damp with sweat, her eyes overly bright with fever. He cursed, a single sharp word. This won't do, he said. It was what he'd said about her night on the floor, but this time his voice was different. It was the practical voice of a man dealing with a sick livestock. He came over and put a large, rough hand on her forehead. His palm was calloused, but it was warm. You're burning, he said, stating a fact. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a dipper of water. Drink. He held it to her lips, and she drank, spilling half of it down her chin. Her whole body convulsed in a shiver. Damnation, he muttered. He stood there, a giant shadow in the small room, looking down at her. He was trapped. He couldn't send her out. He couldn't let her die on the cot. He made his decision. It was pragmatic, not kind. All right, he said, as if arguing with himself. Come on. He didn't wait for her to move. He bent, slid one arm under her back and the other under her knees. and lifted her from the cot. She weighed nothing. She was a bundle of sticks and fever. Anna let out a small, terrified sound. He was carrying her. He crossed the 3 feet of open floor and dumped her, unceremoniously, onto his own bed. It was a nest of heavy wool and soft cured furs. It was warm. The scent of him was everywhere, smoke, pine, and clean male sweat. It was overwhelming. "You sleep here," he said, his voice gruff. "It's the only place in this house the wind don't cut." He pulled the heavy blankets and furs up over her, tucking them in around her shoulders with an impersonal efficiency. She instantly stopped shivering. She was cocooned in a profound, dizzying warmth. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fever and confusion. "Mr. Hart, go to sleep," he said. "It's easier to send you away if you're not dead." He blew out the lamp. The darkness returned. Anna Lee lay in her husband's bed, wrapped in his scent, burning with fever. She heard him move back to the cot. She heard the ropes creak as his heavy frame settled onto the tiny bed that had been meant for her. He did not fit. He was too large, too solid for such a flimsy thing. He lay there, 10 feet away, and did not sleep. She knew he didn't. She could feel his wakefulness in the dark. He was a guardian, trapped in a duty he despised, caring for a wife he never wanted. And Anna, lost in a cloud of sickness and warmth, finally, mercifully, fell into unconsciousness. The fever held Anna Lee captive for 3 days. She drifted in and out of a gray, suffocating fog, aware only of 2 things, the biting cold of the cabin and the cocoon of warmth that was Silas Hart's bed. He tended to her like he would a sick animal, with a rough, impersonal efficiency that was almost brutal, yet saved her life. He forced broth, hot and salty, between her chattering teeth. He'd leave the cabin for hours, and she would drift, terrified he was gone for good. Then the door would burst open on a wave of frigid air, and he'd be back, his arms full of firewood. He'd curse the cot, which was too small for his frame, and sit in the chair by the stove, watching the fire. He never spoke to her, but when the fever sweat soaked her dress, he left a clean flannel shirt of his own, worn soft as linen, on the chest. "Change," he'd ordered, his back to her, and he did not turn around until she whispered she was done. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Anna woke, and the world was sharp again. The first thing she saw was Silas, standing at the window, drinking coffee, staring out at the endless white. He heard her stir. "You're awake," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. "Good." He finished his coffee and set the tin cup down. "I'm riding out." A knot of fear tightened in her chest. "To town?" "County seat, to see the judge. Proper. The clerk in town talks too much." He pulled on his heavy coat. He was going to see, finally, if this knot could be untied. He was going to see if he could be rid of her. He was gone for 2 days. Anna used the time to build her strength. She moved from his bed, changing the sheets she'd soiled, and collapsed back onto her own cot. She scrubbed the cabin again, a desperate need to repay the debt of her own survival. She cooked a stew of beans and salt pork, leaving it on the stove. When he returned, he was a different kind of cold. The first time, he had been angry. This time, he was resigned, and it was worse. He walked in, shaking the snow from his hat, and didn't look at her. He just went to the stove and ladled a bowl of the stew. He ate standing up. "Well?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "It's legal," he said, not looking at her. "As binding as a brand. My brother's signature on the proxy is good as mine. The judge says we're married. Unless I want to file for a contest. Take it to the High Court in Cheyenne. Cost $1,000 I don't have. And take a year. And in that time," he finally turned, his eyes flat and hard as iron, "you'd be a ward of the county. Or worse." He meant the women who worked in the saloons. He meant she'd be thrown back on the road. Anna Lee stood tall. The fever had burned away the last of her St. Louis fragility. She was pale, thin as a rail, but her spine was straight. "I see. Then I will hold to my promise. Mr. Hart, I will not be a burden. I will earn my keep. You said I could stay until spring." "I did. I will work," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she had. "I will cook. I will clean. I will mend. I will work this land with you. I won't be a wife. I will be your hired hand. And when the thaw comes, if you still want me gone, I will go." Silas watched her. He saw the new steel in her. He saw a woman who had been to the edge and hadn't broken. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Fine," he said. "We have a bargain, but there are rules." "Yes, sir." "First," he said, "you'll move your things to the spare room." Anna looked around. There was no spare room. "Sir?" He pointed to a narrow, curtained-off alcove behind the stove. It was barely a closet, meant for storage. "That's your space. The cot goes there. This main room is mine." It was a clear boundary. She was being moved from the center of the house to its absolute margin. "I understand." "Second," he said, his voice dropping, "you don't touch my things, my bed, that chest, this desk." He tapped a small, locked writing desk in the corner. "They are mine. They are not for you. You do not clean them. You do not open them. You do not look at them. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Hart." "And last," he paused, and the air in the room grew heavy. "This arrangement, it's a roof, it's work. It is not a marriage. There will be no talk of kindness, no talk of love. You are here for shelter. I am here because the law says I must be. That is all." "I understand completely," Anna said, and her voice was as cold and clear as his. "You have my word." And so the winter truly began. Anna worked. She rose before him, her hands stiff with cold as she broke the ice in the water bucket to make coffee. She learned to bake a passable bread in the heavy Dutch oven, burying it in the coals of the fire. He gave her the mending. His clothes were in tatters, held together by stubbornness. Her fingers, bred for silk, bled. The heavy denim and canvas fought the needle. The lye soap she used for washing his clothes cracked her hands open, leaving small, red fissures across her knuckles. At night, she would sit on her cot, hidden by the curtain, and bite her lip as she rubbed salt and lard into the cuts to keep them from festering. She took over the barn. He had 2 horses, a draft mule, and 3 milk cows. The work was heavy. She learned to muck the stalls, her body screaming in protest. The pitchfork was taller than she was, and the wet hay was a solid, stinking weight. But she did it, every day. Silas watched her. He was a silent shadow. He'd watch her strain to lift the hay bale. He'd see the new, hard muscle forming in her arms. He'd see her hands tremble when she passed him his plate at supper. She never complained. Not once. She never sighed, never wept, never flinched from a task. She just worked, from first light to long after dark. The loneliness of the place was a physical weight. The ranch was miles from anything. The only sounds were the constant high shriek of the wind and, at night, the howling of the wolves. Their cries would echo off the bluff, a hungry, lonely sound that made Anna's skin crawl. The snow piled in drifts against the door, creeping through the cracks in the walls. They lived in that crushing silence. 2 people trapped in a box, breathing the same cold air but never touching. They were ghosts in each other's lives. One night, Silas came in from the line shack, half frozen. He'd been checking for stray cattle. The cabin was warm, the smell of stew in the air, but Anna was not at the stove. He frowned. He put his rifle on the rack and walked to her curtained alcove. "Woman," he called out. He pulled the curtain back. The cot was empty. A flicker of something panic stirred in his chest. He grabbed his coat and went back outside. The wind hit him. sharp as glass. "Anna!" he yelled, his voice torn away by the gale. He heard a sound, not the wind, from the barn. He stalked over, his boots crunching in the deep snow. He slid the heavy barn door open. It was dark, smelling of animals and hay. He heard it again. A small, muffled sound. He found her in an empty stall, huddled behind a stack of hay bales. She was trying to cry without making a sound, her shoulders shaking in a violent, silent rhythm. He stood over her, a dark shape in the gloom. He was angry. She had broken the rules. She had brought emotion into their bargain. "What is it?" he demanded. It was not a question of concern. It was an order. She started, scrambling to her feet, wiping her face with her raw, cracked hands. "Nothing, Mr. Hart. I'm sorry. What is it?" She looked at him, her face a pale oval in the darkness, and the truth, or part of it, just fell out. It was too heavy to hold alone anymore. "I had nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You said that. In St. Louis," she said, the words rushing out. "I was ruined. A man, he was important. He hurt me. And because I would not be quiet about it, because I would not marry him to cover the shame my father, he disowned me. He told me I was no daughter of his. He cast me out." She was shaking now, not from cold, but from the memory. "I am not just a bride you didn't want. Mr. Hart, I am a woman who does not exist. There is no one looking for me. There is nowhere for me to go back to." Silas stood there, his face unreadable in the dark. He had assumed she was a fool, a romantic, or a grifter. He had not assumed she was another broken thing. Just like him, she was ruined by a man's cruelty. He was ruined by it. He stared at her for a long time. The only sound was her quiet, hitching breath. He said nothing. He turned, his boots scuffing the packed dirt floor, and walked out of the barn, leaving her alone in the dark. But things changed. The next morning, when Anna woke on her cot, there was a tin cup of hot, sweet tea on the floor beside her. He had already left for the day, but he had made it for her. The next night, the wood box beside the stove, the one she fed all day, was stacked high, and beside her cot, there was a separate, small pile of dry kindling, enough for her to start her own small fire if she got cold. He never mentioned the barn. He never spoke a word, but he left her tea. He left her wood. They were small, silent gestures. He was not offering kindness. He was offering truce. The iron wall between them had a crack in it. One afternoon, a rare, bright day broke the gray monotony. The sun was so bright on the snow it hurt the eyes. They were outside, mending a section of fence that had been knocked down by a drifting buffalo. She was holding the heavy post steady while he used the sledgehammer. The thud of the mallet, the only sound. Anna looked at the patch of frozen ground by the cabin's front step. "Mr. Hart?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Aye," he grunted, lining up his swing. "When the spring comes," she said, if I am still here, might I plant some flowers? Just there, by the step." Silas stopped, the heavy hammer resting on the ground. He looked at the spot she was pointing to. He looked at the vast, bleak, wind-scoured land around them. "No," he said. She flinched, her gaze dropping to the snow. "I'm sorry, I just thought—" "They won't last here," he said, his voice flat, not unkind, just full of a terrible certainty. "The wind takes everything. The frost comes in August. It's wasted effort. Nothing soft grows here. Anna." He had called her Anna, not woman, not you. He was not just talking about flowers. A week later, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the real storm came. It was not just snow, it was a white darkness that fell from the sky. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. For 3 days, they were trapped inside. The cabin, which had felt empty, now felt suffocatingly small. They couldn't go to the barn. They brought the mule's water bucket inside to keep it from freezing solid. Silas sat in his chair by the stove, sharpening knives, his face grim. Anna sat on her cot, mending a saddle blanket. The air was thick with their shared presence. On the third night, the storm was at its peak. The cabin groaned as the wind tried to tear it apart. Silas hadn't gone to his bed. He was asleep in his chair, a blanket over his legs, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He was keeping watch, feeding the fire every hour, making sure the storm didn't win. Anna was on her cot, drifting in a fitful sleep. Then she cried out. It was not a word. It was a high, thin sound of pure terror. "No, no, please don't touch me! Get off me!" She was back in that carriage in St. Louis. She was fighting a ghost. She bolted upright, her hands flailing, her eyes wide and blind with nightmare. "Please!" Silas was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. He grabbed the rifle, thinking the wolves had broken in, that the door was down. He saw her. She was trembling, tangled in her blanket, her breath coming in wild, panicked gasps. She was there, but she was also 1,000 miles away, in a place of terrible darkness. He put the rifle down. He stood for a long moment, just watching her. The fear on her face was so raw, so real. It was a fear he recognized. He didn't speak. He walked to his own bed, took the heavy wool blanket from it, and walked back to her. She flinched as he approached, as if expecting a blow. He stopped, gently, as if handling a spooked colt. He draped the heavy, warm blanket around her shaking shoulders. She looked up at him, her terror-filled eyes slowly coming back into focus. She saw his face, hard and worn in the firelight. She saw the cabin. She was safe. The tears that came were not from the dream, but from the simple, unexpected weight of the blanket. She looked at him, and the question she had whispered her first night came out again. But this time it meant something entirely different. "Where?" she whispered, her voice choked. "Where will I sleep?" It was not a question about the cot or the floor. It was a plea. Where, in this world, was there a safe place for her? Silas did not answer. He did not go back to his chair. He just stood there, watching her, and in his flat, gray eyes, under the anger and the grief, Anna saw something new, a strange, quiet softness, a recognition. He saw her. He didn't move, but the ice around his heart had begun to crack. The storm passed. The silence that returned was different. It was less empty. They spoke more. "Coffee's hot," she'd say. "Mending's on the chest." He'd reply. It was a start. The thaw began. A slow, muddy affair. Silas was out most days, riding the fence lines, leaving Anna to the cabin. It was during one of these absences that she found it. She was cleaning that small writing desk in the corner, the one he'd forbidden her to touch. A small brass key had fallen from his heavy coat pocket, landing on the floor. She had picked it up, intending to put it on the table. But she stood before the desk. He had forbidden it. But her curiosity, it wasn't curiosity. It was a need to understand the man whose bed she had slept in, whose blanket she now kept on her cot. She needed to understand the grief that walled him in. Her hand shook. She slid the key into the lock. It turned. She opened the drawer. It was full of legal papers, deeds to the land, cattle receipts. But tucked underneath them was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She lifted it out. Inside was the tin type. She had seen photographs before, but none like this. It was a woman, a native woman, from one of the local tribes. She was beautiful, with a proud, strong face and eyes so dark and kind they seemed to pull Anna in. Her hair was in 2 long braids, and she wore a simple cotton dress. But around her neck was a necklace of intricate beadwork. And she was holding a child, a baby girl, not more than a year old, wrapped in a blanket. The child was looking at the camera with bright, curious eyes. Anna's breath caught. She looked closer. On the baby's feet, just visible, were a tiny pair of beaded boots, the same reddish-brown as the boot she'd found under his chest. This was his family. This was Wea. This was the baby girl. This was the life he had lost. This was the ghost. She heard the sound of a horse outside. Her heart jumped into her throat. He was back. She fumbled with the picture, trying to put it back, to lock the drawer, but she was too slow. The door swung open. Silas stood there, filling the frame. He saw her. He saw her at his desk. He saw the unlocked drawer. He saw the tintype in her hand. His face, which had held that new softness, went utterly blank. It was the calm of a prairie sky just before a tornado hits. "I told you," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "not to touch my things." "Silas, she began, using his name. "I found the key. She is beautiful. Was this your wife?" The word wife was a trigger. His roar was a sound of pure, wounded agony. "You have no right!" He crossed the room in 2 strides and snatched the photograph from her hand, his fingers closing over it, crushing the tin. "You have no right to look at her. You have no right to speak her name." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "You think you can replace her?" He seethed, his whole body shaking. He was not just angry, he was broken open. "You think you can come in here and clean my floors and sleep on my cot, and that it makes you anything to me?" "No, Silas, never!" "Get away from it." He slammed the drawer shut with such force that a small crack appeared in the wood. He turned on her, his eyes wild with a grief so profound it was terrifying. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing something else, something awful. "You know nothing," he spat, his voice thick with hate and tears he would not shed. "You know nothing of what happened here." He grabbed his coat from the peg. He didn't take his rifle. He didn't take supplies. "Silas, wait!" she cried, reaching for him. "The snow is still deep. Where are you going?" He shoved her arm away, not with cruelty, but with a blind, desperate need to escape. He slammed the door. The sound echoed through the small cabin like a gunshot. The entire house seemed to shudder. Anna was left alone, her hand outstretched, her heart hammering against her ribs. He didn't come back. The sun set, turning the snow to a sea of blue and purple. The cabin grew cold. She built up the fire, but the room was empty. The wolves began to howl, their calls closer this time. And Silas' heart was gone, having vanished into the snow and into the terrible, raw grief she had so foolishly uncovered. He was gone all that night and all the next day. She waited for a day and a night, and on the second morning, when the sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky, he came back. Anna heard him long before she saw him. It was not the sound of a man walking, but of a man falling. A heavy stumble on the porch, a long, drawn-out groan, and then a thud as his body slumped against the door. She ran and tore it open. Silas collapsed inward, a dead weight of snow, ice, and misery. He fell to his knees on the floor she had scrubbed, and the reek of cheap whiskey rolled off him, a sour cloud that mingled with the sharp, clean smell of the deep cold. He was covered in frost. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His lips were blue. "Silas!" she cried. He was near frozen, but he was also burning. She put her hand to his neck and felt the dangerous, dry heat of a profound fever. He had walked himself into a stupor, collapsed somewhere in the snow, and then, by some animal instinct, dragged himself home to die. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You will not." She put her shoulder under his arm and hauled. He was a mountain of a man, and she was a willow stick. She dragged him, inch by painful inch, across the floor, away from the open door and toward the stove. She couldn't lift him to his bed. His bed was a fortress she would not breach again. She dragged him onto the braided rug by the hearth. She slammed the door shut, locking out the white world that had tried to claim him. His coat was frozen to him. She had to fight the buttons, her fingers numb. She found a knife in the kitchen and cut the laces of his boots, pulling them from his numb, white feet. She worked with a desperate, frantic energy, stripping off his wet, frozen layers, cursing his weight, cursing his grief, cursing the land. She left him in his long wool undergarments and then piled every blanket, every quilt, every spare piece of canvas she could find on top of him. He was shaking, a deep, rattling quake that seemed to come from the core of the earth. She built the fire up until the stove roared, the metal glowing a faint red in the dim light. She boiled water, forcing sips of it between his cracked, blue lips. He was not with her. He was somewhere else, somewhere terrible. Through the long night, she sat on the floor beside him, wiping his face with a damp rag, holding his hand. It was not a gesture of tenderness. It was an anchor. She held on, as if she could physically keep his soul from fleeing his body. And in his fever, he spoke. The walls he had built around his heart crumbled, and the ghosts poured out. "Where ya?" he moaned, his head thrashing on the rug. "Why ya? Listen to me. Take the horse. Ride south. Don't wait for me." Anna froze. Waya, the woman in the photograph, his wife. "No," he whispered, a terrible, pleading sound. "Not the cabin. Run to the creek. Elk Run, take Elk Run." Elk Run, the baby girl, a name. His body went rigid, his hand crushing hers. His eyes flew open, but they were blind, seeing only the past. "They're coming! White men, fire god! Oh God, the smoke!" He was reliving it. Anna sat, paralyzed, a witness to the horror that had hollowed him out. "Baby girl," he sobbed, and the sound was so broken it tore Anna's own heart in two. She had her boots on. She just learned." He let out a sound that was not a word, a howl of pure, animal grief that filled the small cabin. "I wasn't here. I was fixing the fence. I wasn't here." He collapsed back, the fever taking him under. He muttered names, places, fragments of a language she didn't understand, the language he must have shared with his wife. Anna sat in the dark, the tears streaming down her own face, her hand still crushed in his. She finally understood. The child's boot under the chest, the fury in his eyes. It was not just loss. It was a massacre. It was a settler raid, the kind she had read about in polite St. Louis newspapers, the kind they called cleansings. And he had been fixing a fence while his world burned. She held his hand all night. She did not sleep. She watched a strong man be torn apart by his own memories, and she did not look away. He woke 2 days later. The fever was gone, leaving him weak, pale, and empty. He woke on the floor, the quilts piled on him, and saw her asleep in the chair, her head slumped on the table. He said nothing. He sat up, his body aching, his head pounding. He looked at the empty whiskey bottle he still had in his pocket, then looked at her. He stood, shaky, and put another log on the fire. When she woke, he was sitting at the table, drinking black coffee. The shame and anger in the room were so thick she could barely breathe. He wouldn't look at her. He was furious that she had seen him, that she had heard. She said nothing. She got up, her back aching, and made him broth. She put it in front of him. "You were sick," she said quietly, giving him an excuse. "The cold." He looked at her, his gray eyes dead. "I know what I was." He drank the broth. The bargain was still in place, but she had seen the ghosts, and he knew it. A few days later, while Silas was out checking traps, Anna was tidying the main room. She was folding the blankets he had used on the floor when something slipped from between them. It was not from his drunken collapse. It was old. It was a letter addressed to Mr. Silas Hart, Hart's Bluff, Wyoming territory. The postmark was from Laramie, dated 2 years prior. It was from his brother, Elias, the meddler, and it had never been opened. The wax seal was still intact. Anna held it to the light. It was thick. It was probably full of apologies, of justifications, of pleas for reconciliation from the brother who had sent him a wife he didn't want, a brother who had tried to fix a wound that could never be fixed. She thought of Silas, his face ravaged by fever, screaming his wife's name. She thought of this letter, sitting here for 2 years, a little bomb of memory waiting to go off. He had seen it and had chosen to let it lie. He didn't need any more pain. He didn't need any more ghosts. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think twice. She walked to the stove, opened the grate, and dropped the letter into the flames. She watched the paper curl, the black ink of his name vanishing into ash. It was not her secret to keep, but it was not her burden to give him. It was an act of quiet mercy. The long winter began to give way to a muddy, ugly spring. The isolation of the ranch was broken one afternoon by the sound of wagon wheels and a cheerful, booming voice. "Who? The house! Anyone alive in there?" A man named Phineas Cole, a traveling trader, pulled his wagon of pots, pans, tools, and news up to their cabin. He was a welcome sight, a blast of life from the outside world. Silas was wary, but he bought coffee and a new axe head. Phineas was a talker, and Anna brought him a hot cup, hungry for any voice that wasn't hers or Silas's. "It's been a hard winter all over," Phineas said, gulping the coffee. "But town's lively. Had a stranger in for a few weeks, asking questions. Caused a bit of a stir." "That's so," Silas said, counting out coins. "Aye, a rich fella. From back east. St. Louis, I heard him say." Anna, who was wiping the table, stopped. Her hand, holding the rag, froze in midair. "He was posting notices," Phineas continued, oblivious. "Asking after a woman, a runaway. He claimed, a Miss Anna Lee, well, ain't that a thing?" He squinted at her. "He didn't give no description, just the name." The blood drained from Anna's face. She felt the floor tilt. Wendell Cartwright, he was looking for her. He had not let her go. He was a man who did not tolerate being defied. He would not just let her disappear. She felt Silas move. He hadn't looked at her, but he had felt the change in the room. He stepped slightly, so his body was between her and the trader. "Never heard of her," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "This your last stop, Cole?" "Just about," the trader said, missing the sudden ice in the air. "Well, if you see anyone fitting that, you tell him Sheriff Miller in town is holding the mail." "We'll do that," Silas said. He handed the man his coins. "Good day." The door closed. The wagon wheels creaked away, and the silence that fell was more terrifying than the wind. Anna was shaking so hard she had to grip the back of a chair. He was here. He was looking. Silas stood at the window, his back to her, watching the wagon disappear. He knew, he didn't know the details, but he had seen her terror. He had heard her nightmare in the storm. He had heard her confession in the barn. He put the pieces together. He said nothing. He just stood there, a stone wall at the window, and let her be afraid. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't ask questions, but he had placed his body between her and the news. It was enough. Several days passed. The tension was a living thing. Anna cooked and cleaned and mucked the stalls, but she was a ghost. She jumped at every sound, at the crack of a branch, at the cry of a hawk, thinking it was him. Silas watched her. He was quieter than usual, his face set in a hard, thoughtful grim. One morning, she was in the kitchen alcove, kneading bread. Her hands were covered in flour, her head bowed. She was so lost in her fear, she didn't hear him come in from the barn. He stood in the middle of the room, just looking at her back. He looked at her thin shoulders, at the way her hair was escaping its bun, at the raw, red knuckles of her hands working the dough. She was a bird caught in a trap, and he knew what that felt like. "You're not a punishment," he said. The words were low, gruff. They dropped into the silence like stones. Anna stopped, her hands stilled in the dough. She could not have heard him, right? She turned, her mouth open, flour on her cheek. He was already walking away. He grabbed his coat from the peg and went back outside, letting the door close softly behind him. Anna stood there, tears welling in her eyes. He was not a man of easy words. He had just given her the only absolution he possessed. He had seen her terror. He had seen her shame. And he had just told her that she was not a curse sent to plague him. She was just a person. The wall between them didn't just crack. A stone fell out. The days that followed were different. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the floorboards, but something else was growing beside it, a fragile, tentative softness. He found her one afternoon in the barn, trying to curry his horse, a big roan that was notoriously ill-tempered. The horse kept stamping and trying to bite. "You're holding the brush wrong," he said from the doorway. She jumped. "He won't stand still." Silas walked in. He didn't take the brush from her. He stood beside her, his arm brushing hers, and put his hand over hers. "Slow," he said, his voice low. "Long strokes, like you mean it. They like a firm hand. They know when you're scared." His hand was huge over hers, warm and calloused. He guided her hand over the horse's flank. The horse sighed and leaned into the pressure. Anna's heart was hammering. They stood there for a full minute, brushing the horse together. "There," he said, and stepped back. "He's yours to brush, now." He was trusting her with his horse. She started to hum. She hadn't hummed she couldn't remember. It was an old tune her mother used to play on the piano. She was cooking supper, and the sound just came out. Silas was at the table, oiling a saddle. He stopped. He listened. It was a sound of life, of simple, quiet contentment. He did not tell her to be quiet. He just listened. They started to talk by the firelight. The cabin felt almost safe. They were not confessions. They were just stories, half-truths that built a bridge. He told her about the first time he'd seen the mountains, how they'd scared him more than the ocean ever could. She told him about a dog she'd had as a child, a little terrier. One night, she looked into the flames and gave him a piece of her. "I used to dream," she said, her voice soft, "of a house, not a grand house, like my father's. Just a small house by a river with blue curtains and a man who never raised his voice." She was telling him what Wendell had been, what her father had been. Silas watched her face in the firelight. He saw the memory of fear in her eyes, and he saw the longing for peace. He let the silence sit. Then he spoke. "The thaw's here. The roads will be clear in a week." Her breath hitched. This was it, the end of their bargain. "Silas," she began. "You planning on staying?" he asked. The question was blunt, practical, but it held the weight of the world. He was not asking her to stay. He was asking what she intended. She looked at him, this hard, broken man who had shared his horses and his warmth with her, this man who had told her she was not a punishment. "I don't know," she whispered. It was a lie, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. They both knew she had nowhere to go, and for the first time he had nowhere he wanted her to be. The next night, the sky broke open. It was a spring thunderstorm, a wild, violent thing. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it shook the very foundations of the cabin. It was not the mournful wail of winter. It was a percussive, violent assault. Anna was on her cot, behind the curtain. The first crash of thunder made her gasp. The second, which sounded like a cannon firing just outside the door, made her scream. It was not the storm. It was the sound. It was the sound of a heavy hand striking a door, the sound of her father's voice, the sound of Wendell's fist hitting the carriage wall. It was violence. She scrambled from the cot, her heart choking her, and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran from the curtain, into the main room, her hands over her ears. A flash of lightning lit the cabin, and she saw him. Silas. He was sitting up in his bed. He was not startled. He was just watching her. She stood in the middle of the floor, frozen, trembling from head to toe. She was a child, lost in a dark wood, and the wolves were howling. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the dark. He saw her terror. He understood it was not the storm she feared. He didn't speak. He didn't call her name. He simply lifted the heavy wool blanket on the empty side of his bed. He lifted it, and with his other hand, he tapped the sheet. Once, twice. An invitation, a sanctuary. Anna stood rooted to the spot. This was his bed, the bed of his wife, the bed he had kept sacred. He was offering it to her. She was trembling, but it was not with fear of him. It was with a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief. Grief for him, for his lost Wea, for her own ruined life, and for this terrible, beautiful, broken kindness. She walked forward, her feet numb on the cold floor. She did not take off her nightdress. She did not pause. She lay down stiffly on top of the blankets, her back to him, and curled into a tight ball. She felt the weight of the blanket he had lifted as he draped it over her, covering her shoulders. They lay there in the dark, two rigid, separate bodies in the same bed. They did not touch. He did not put his arm around her. He did not whisper comfort. But the thunder cracked again, and this time, she did not flinch. She could feel the heat of his body. Inches away, she could hear him breathe. He was breathing slow, deliberately, and Anna, listening to him, matched her own ragged breath to his. In and out, in and out. They lay there for hours, the storm raging outside, and their breathing, together, was the only thing that was real. They woke to a cold, gray light. Anna had, at some point in the night, turned to face him. She had woken with her forehead pressed against his shoulder, her hand clutching his shirt. He was still, his arm a warm, heavy weight across her waist, holding her steady against the storm's memory. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. There was no passion in his eyes, only a deep, exhausted stillness. He had offered sanctuary, and she had taken it. The rules of their bargain had been washed away in the night. He moved first. He lifted his arm, and she drew back, a flush rising on her neck. The intimacy, in the cold light of day, was a shock. "The storm's past," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," she whispered. She slipped from the bed, her feet hitting the cold floor, and fled to the imagined safety of her curtained alcove. She dressed, her hands shaking, her mind a riot. She was not a wife. She was not a hired hand. She was something in between, something with no name, and in the Wyoming territory, a thing with no name was a dangerous thing to be. The world outside the cabin had decided to name it for them. Silas rode into Hart's Bluff 3 days later for salt and grain. The town was 20 miles of hard riding. A small, wind-beaten collection of false-fronted buildings huddled around a single muddy street. He'd always been an outcast there. The town was built on land his father had settled, but his choice of a wife, his wildness, his refusal to join their church or their councils, had made him a ghost to them. They took his money but never met his eye. This time it was different. When he walked into the mercantile, the conversation did not just quiet, it stopped. Sharp and sudden. The men at the stove turned to stare. He saw Mrs. Miller, the sheriff's wife, pull her young daughter close, as if he were a carrier of plague. "Hart," said the clerk, his face pale. "Just the usual?" "And oats," Silas said. The silence was loud, judgmental. He felt their eyes on his back. He was no longer the sad, grieving widower. He was a scandal. The traitor, Phineas Cole, had talked. The news of the St. Louis woman, combined with his long isolation, had brewed a new, ugly rumor. He was loading the grain onto his mule when the preacher approached. Reverend Gideon was a thin, hard man, with a Bible in one hand and a spine of iron. He believed in God, and he believed in order. Mr. Hart, Gideon said, his voice firm. A word. Silas finished tying the knot. Reverend, the town council is concerned. About what? Silas said, his voice flat. About the woman, sir, Gideon said, his eyes narrowing. The woman you are keeping. She's my wife, Silas said. The word felt strange on his tongue. By contract. A piece of paper from a mail-order catalog? Gideon scoffed. His piety offended. That is not a marriage in the eyes of God. That is a convenience. Mr. Hart, and the town will not stand for it. They are good, God-fearing people. They will not have this arrangement poison the well. Poison, Silas repeated, his voice dangerously low. They say, the preacher leaned in, that you are keeping a fallen woman, that you are living in sin, openly, in defiance of decency. It is a shame upon your father's name, and the council, they will not abide it. They mean to intervene. Intervene, Silas said. You and what army, Reverend? For her sake, Mr. Hart, Gideon said, his voice rising, full of self-righteous fire. That woman is living under your roof, unprotected, unblessed. If she is unwilling, we have a duty to remove her. If she is willing, then she is a degenerate, and we will remove her all the same. The council meets on Sunday. I suggest you make your peace with God, and with us. Silas just stared at him. He saw the faces of the men watching from the mercantile porch. He saw their righteous, hungry anger. It was the same anger he had seen in the smoke, all those years ago. He untied his mule. Tell the council, he said, his voice a low growl, to stay off my land, or I will make my peace with them. He rode out of town, the preachers furious, unanswered prayers chasing him. When he got back to the ranch, he was a storm cloud. Anna saw it the moment he walked in. She had supper ready, a rabbit stew. He ignored it. He stalked to the window and stared out, his hands clenched into fists. Silas? She asked, her voice small. What is it? The town, he bit out. They're concerned. Anna's hand went to her throat. Concerned? About Wendell? No, he said, turning, and his face was a mask of cold fury. About you, about me, about us. The preacher paid a visit. Seems the good people of Hart's Bluff don't approve of our arrangement. They think I'm keeping a fallen woman. Anna stopped breathing. The floor dropped out from under her. It was St. Louis all over again. The judgment, the whispers, the pointing fingers. They think I'm your... She couldn't say the word. They think we're living in sin, he said, his voice sharp with a disgust she couldn't place. The town council, they're threatening to intervene, to take you. Take me, she whispered. Like they did for my own good? For my protection? He heard the terror in her voice, the echo of her past, and his anger faltered, replaced by a deep, weary pain. Aye, like that. Anna stood there for a long, frozen moment. She had done it. She had finally and truly ruined a man. She had escaped Wendell only to bring the world's judgment down on the one person who had shown her a shred of kindness. She had become his shame. I will not, she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. What? I will not be your shame, Silas. She turned from the stove and walked to her alcove. She pulled the curtain back. She knelt and pulled out her old, battered travel bag. Silas watched her. What are you doing? It was not a question. I am leaving, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. She began to pack her few things, her other dress, the brush, the lye soap. I survived my father's disgrace. I will not be the cause of yours. If I am gone, then I am just a runaway. Like the traitor said, Wendell will have no one to find here. The town will leave you be. She stood up, the bag in her hand. You will have your peace back. Peace? The word was so full of venom it stopped her cold. He laughed, a short, ugly, broken sound. Peace. You think that's what I had when you came here? You think this silence was peace? He stalked toward her, and for the first time, she saw him truly unguarded. His eyes were raw, his face a landscape of agony. You think I don't know what they're saying? He demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think I don't know what they call you? It's the same name they called her. Anna's breath caught. Waya. Aye, Waya. He said the name, and this time it did not break him. It fueled him. My wife, in the eyes of her people, in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the law, not to the town, to them. She was my squaw, my convenience. He spat the preacher's word. You found the picture, he said, his hands clenching and unclenching. You heard me in the fever, but you don't know the truth. You don't know what they did. He grabbed her arm, not to hurt her, but to hold her, to make her listen. They came on a Tuesday. I was mending a fence on the North Ridge, a whole day's ride. He was shaking now, seeing it. I saw the smoke. I thought it was a grass fire. I rode back. He let go of her, pacing the small room like a caged wolf. It wasn't a raid. It wasn't warriors. It was a cleansing. That's what the papers in Cheyenne called it. Settlers. Men from the town, from Hart's Bluff. Men I'd had a drink with. They decided the land needed to be made safe, and they started with the half-breed's cabin. Anna put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. By the time I got back, he choked. The cabin was ash. They were gone. Wea and Elk Run, my baby girl. He stopped, his back to her, his whole body rigid with the memory. They were not kind, Anna. They made an example of her, because she was native, because she was mine. And my girl, my baby girl, she was wearing those little boots, the ones you found. He turned, and his face was a ruin. The tears he had held back for years were finally tracking through the dust on his cheeks. I have hated myself every single day since. I've hated this land. I've hated every man in that town. I've hated my own white skin. I hated that I was mending a damned fence while my world was burning. He looked at her packed bag, at her plan to give him peace. You talk about peace, he whispered, his voice broken. I don't deserve peace. Anna, I don't deserve a warm meal or a clean floor or a woman's hand in mine. I don't deserve yours. She was crying, not for herself, not for her own lost life. She was crying for him, for the impossible, crushing weight he had been carrying alone, for years, in this empty, silent room. She dropped her bag. She walked right up to him, until she was standing in the circle of his grief. Then you'll have none, she said, her voice as broken and as fierce as his. He looked down at her, confused, his breath hitching. What? Peace, she said, and she put her small, chapped hand on his chest. She could feel his heart hammering, a frantic, trapped thing. You'll have none of it, because I gave it to you freely, and you took it. You took it when you gave me that blanket in the storm. You took it when you told me I wasn't a punishment. You took it. It's yours now. Silas, you don't get to give it back. He stared at her, utterly undone. This woman, this broken, ruined woman, was refusing to let him be damned. She was standing in the fire with him. He reached up, his hand shaking, and touched her face. His calloused, rough thumb brushed the tear from her cheek. He was not a man of gentle things. His touch was clumsy, hesitant. He was touching her as if she were a mirage, as if she might vanish and leave him alone again. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing, a small, shuddering sigh escaping her. That was all it took. He leaned in, his eyes fixed on hers, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of desperation. It was hesitant, shaking, and clumsy. His lips were chapped, tasting of salt and coffee and the iron of his own grief. It was not the kiss of a lover. It was the kiss of a drowning man finding air. It was two people, clinging to a ledge in the dark, their fingernails bloody. It was all his longing, all his guilt, and all her defiant hope wrapped into one desperate, trembling moment. When they broke apart, they were both shaking. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I will not let them take you, Anna," he whispered. "I will not." That night, the cabin was silent. The preacher was in town, planning his intervention. Wendell was somewhere on the road, closing in. The world was gathering its forces against them. Anna lay on her cot, behind her curtain. Silas lay in his bed. The barrier was back, the space between them a cold, dark ocean. He could not sleep. He could hear her breathing, soft and troubled. He could not go back. He could not be the man he was. She had seen him, all of him, and she had not run. "Anna," he said into the dark. A pause, then, "Yes." She was awake. He did not have the words. He did not know how to say, "I am a broken man, but I am less broken with you." He did not know how to say, "Stay." So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He reached over and lifted the heavy wool blanket, and with his other hand, he tapped the sheet, once, twice. From behind the curtain, he heard her rise. He heard her bare feet on the wooden floor. She did not hesitate. She did not stop. She walked to his bed. She did not lie stiffly on top. She pulled the blanket back herself, and she slipped in beside him. This was not the chaste comfort of the storm. This was a choice. He turned to her, and she turned to him. In the faint moonlight from the window, he saw the fear in her eyes, but also the resolve. There was no seduction. There was only a profound, human need to not be alone. It was a quiet, solemn act, a vow made not of words, but of warmth. When he touched her, his hands were shaking. When she touched him, hers were, too. It was a mending, a slow, hesitant stitching together of two torn, frayed pieces of cloth. It was a promise to stay, a promise to hold back the dark, together, for one more night. The days that followed were a strange, fragile peace, a quiet joy. The town did not intervene, not yet. They were waiting, gathering their righteousness, and in that small bubble of stolen time, Anna and Silas built something that looked almost like a life. She hummed. The sound, once so rare, was now a constant presence in the cabin as she baked bread. He let her brush the horses. He trusted her. They shared meals, and they talked. He told her about a time his father had tried to teach him to rope, and he'd ended up roping the water trough instead. A low, rusty chuckle escaped him. Anna laughed, a real, bright sound that startled them both, and he smiled, a true, unguarded smile that lit his gray eyes. The house, once a tomb, was just a house. One afternoon, he came in from the barn. She was at the stove, her back to him. He came up behind her, and for a long moment, just stood there, breathing in the smell of her hair and the flour on her hands. He rested his hands on her shoulders. She stilled, then leaned her head back against his chest, a small, trusting gesture that made his heart ache. They stood like that, just breathing. It was not passion. It was something more. It was peace. It was a peace that could not last. It was broken by the sound of a horse, not the easy, loping gait of a local rancher. This was a fast, arrogant stride, a thoroughbred. Anna was outside, scattering feed for the few chickens she'd coaxed into laying. She heard the horse, and she looked up. Her hand went to her mouth. The feed scattered at her feet. A man was riding toward the cabin. A man in a fine, dark wool suit and a bowler hat. A man with a handsome, cruel face and eyes like chips of ice. Silas came out of the barn, a hammer in his hand. He saw the rider, But he looked at Anna. Her face was white, her body frozen in an agony of terror. He knew, before the man even spoke, that the peace was over. The man reined in his horse, looking down at them with a sneer of pure contempt. He looked at the cabin, at the mud, at Anna's plain wool dress. "Anna, my dear," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured oil that slid over the rough land. This is where you ran to, this hovel, and with this?" He nodded at Silas, as if he were a piece of livestock. "Wendell," she whispered, the name a curse. "Get off my land," Silas said. His voice was a low, quiet growl. He dropped the hammer. Wendell Cartwright laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your land? I am not here for your land, you savage. I'm here for my property." He reached into his fine coat and pulled out a packet of papers, slapping them against his riding glove. "Anna Lee, you are declared, by a judge in St. Louis, mentally unfit, a danger to yourself and a disgrace to your family. Your father," he smiled, a terrible, thin smile, "has signed you over to my care. You are my legal ward. Anna, you belong to me." "That's a lie," Anna whispered, shaking her head. He wouldn't." "Your father did what was necessary to save his good name from your hysteria," Wendell said, dismounting. He was all polished boots and menace. "Now, you will come. We are going back." Silas stepped in front of Anna, blocking her. He was a foot taller than Wendell, and twice as wide. "She's not going anywhere." Wendell's smile faded. He looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and his eyes were cold and calculating. "You'll want to step aside. Hart, I made inquiries in town. I know all about you. I know what you are. A man who prefers native company. A man who lost his family in a fire. A fire. I hear that some of the good people in town might have set." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "It would be a terrible shame if the federal marshal had to reopen that investigation, had to look into why you're harboring a known, mentally unfit degenerate. They might just decide you're unfit, too. They might just finish the job." He was using the town's prejudice as a weapon. He was threatening to expose Silas's past, to use his grief to destroy him. "Silas, no!" Anna cried, grabbing his arm. "Don't! He'll do it!" Silas looked at Wendell. He was not angry. He was not afraid. He was terrifyingly calm. His hand did not go to the pistol at his hip. "I'll give you one chance," Silas said, his voice so quiet it barely carried. "Leave or die." Wendell Cartwright stared at Silas, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his hip. He was a city man, but he was not a fool. He knew a killing threat when he heard one. He saw the utter lack of fear in Silas's eyes, the cold, settled certainty. Wendell was a man who used power, not brute force. He gave a thin, reptilian smile. "You're a brave man, Hart, and a foolish one. You've made your choice." He tipped his hat to Anna, a gesture of pure, mocking malice. "I will be back for you, my dear. The law is on my side." He mounted his fine horse, turned, and rode away. Not at a gallop, but at a slow, confident walk. He was not defeated. He was just getting reinforcements. The silence he left behind was worse than the confrontation. Anna was shaking so violently she could barely stand. "He'll do it," she whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "Silas, you don't know him. He'll tell them. He'll ruin you. He'll bring the law." "Let him," Silas said. He went to the barn, his movements stiff. "Bolt the door behind me. I'm checking the rifle." "Silas, we have to leave. We have to run." He stopped at the barn door and looked back at her. His face was a mask of hard-won calm. "Anna, I've been running for 5 years. I've been hiding in this house, hiding from the town, hiding from her." He nodded toward the bluff where he must have buried his family. "I'm done running. This is my land. And you are my wife." It was the first time he had said the word with any meaning. It was not a legal term. It was a claim. He went into the barn, and she bolted the cabin door. Night fell. It came on fast, a cold, moonless dark that felt like a shroud. Anna did not light the lamp. They sat in the dark, the only light coming from the red glow of the stove's grate. Silas sat in his chair, his heavy Winchester rifle across his lap. Anna sat on her cot, her travel bag at her feet. She had packed it again, just in case. They did not speak. They just waited. The sound came just before midnight. Not a single horse, several. They were moving slow, trying to be quiet. Silas stood, his movement a silent flow of shadow. He motioned for Anna to get behind the big oak chest. "Stay down," he whispered. A heavy fist pounded on the door. "Silas Hart, open in the name of the law!" It wasn't Wendell's voice. It was a local man, Deputy Sims. "This is a legal matter," another voice yelled. "We have a writ for the woman." Wendell, he was there. "Go away," Silas yelled, his voice low and flat. "You've got no business here." "The business is a writ of protection," Wendell shouted, his voice high with smug triumph. "Issued by the town council to remove Anna Lee from a place of moral and physical danger. Open the door, Hart, or we'll take it down." Silas looked at the door. It was thick pine, but it wouldn't hold. "Anna," he whispered. "The back window. Run for the trees. Hide." "No," she whispered back, her voice fierce. "I will not leave you." "Damn it, woman, go!" A heavy thud hit the door. A ram. They were going to break it down. Silas raised his rifle. He would not shoot a lawman, but he would not let them in. He fired a shot into the ceiling. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. Plaster and dust rained down. "That's your only warning," Silas roared. A moment of silence. Then the door crashed inward, splintering off its hinges, and the room was full of men. 2 deputies, Sims and a younger man, their guns drawn, and behind them, Wendell Cartwright, his face a mask of victory. "She's there," Wendell pointed. "Behind the chest. Get her!" Anna screamed as the younger deputy lunged for her. Silas was not a man. He was a force. He dropped the rifle. He would not shoot them, and met the first deputy, Sims, with a roar. He hit him with his closed fist, a blow that sounded like a side of beef hitting a hook. The man flew backward, out the door, and into the snow. The second deputy grabbed Anna, hauling her up by the arm. She screamed, raking her nails across his face. Silas turned, but Wendell was on him. Wendell was not a fighter, but he had a weapon. He swung a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, catching Silas across the back. Silas grunted, stumbled, but did not fall. He turned on Wendell, his eyes burning with a rage that was almost biblical. He grabbed Wendell by his fine coat, lifting him off the floor. "Silas, your gun!" Anna shrieked. The young deputy, his face bleeding from her scratches, had raised his pistol. Silas turned, still holding Wendell as a shield. He threw the smaller man into the deputy, and all 3 of them went down in a heap. A shot exploded. It was not from the deputy. It was from the doorway. Deputy Sims, back on his feet, his face a mask of blood and terror, had fired his gun. Silas stopped. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his left shoulder. He looked at Sims, his face not in anger, but in surprise. "Silas!" Anna screamed, a sound of pure, torn agony. She tried to run to him, but Wendell, scrambling to his feet, grabbed her by the hair. He put a hand over her mouth, silencing her scream. "You see?" he hissed in her ear. "This is what happens when you defy me." Silas staggered, his hand going to his shoulder. He did not fall, but the fight was gone, bled out of him in that one hot second. The 2 deputies, seeing him wounded, seeing their own panicked error, moved in. They were lawmen, and a man had been shot. This was now their territory. "That's enough, Hart," Sims said, his voice shaking. You're under arrest for assault." They grabbed his good arm. He didn't fight. He just stared at Anna, his face pale, his eyes dark with a pain that had nothing to do with the bullet. Wendell shoved Anna toward the door, his hand still clamped over her mouth. "You'll be silent, my dear, or I'll have them put him in irons." They tied Silas. They looped a rope around his chest and arms, binding the bleeding wound, and cinched him to the very chair he always sat in. They were rough, angry, and scared. "What about him?" the young deputy asked, nodding at Silas. "He'll keep," Wendell said, adjusting his torn collar. "He'll be tended to when the judge convenes. We're taking the woman to town, for her own safety." They dragged her out of the warm, safe cabin, out into the freezing snow, her feet bare. The last thing she saw was Silas, tied to his chair, bleeding, his head bowed, the snow from the open doorway blowing in to cover him. They put her on a horse, tied her hands, and rode for town, leaving him there to die. For an hour, Silas sat. The cold from the broken doorway was a living thing. It seeped into his skin, into his wound. The blood loss was making him dizzy. He had failed. Again. He had seen the smoke. And he had been too late. Again. "Why, he whispered into the empty, ruined room. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He closed his eyes. It would be easy to just stop, to let the cold take him, to join them on the bluff. But then he heard Anna's scream again. Not the one from the fight, the one from her nightmares. The sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He heard Wendell's smug, oily voice. And a new feeling, colder and harder than the wind, moved through him. Rage. He pulled at the ropes. The deputies had been scared. Not smart. The knot was a clumsy one. He strained against it, the movement sending a bolt of white-hot agony through his shoulder. He roared, a low, animal sound, and pulled. The rope bit. The chair groaned, but the hemp slipped. His arm was free. He fumbled with the knots on his other arm, his fingers thick and stupid with cold. He got it. He staggered to his feet. The room spun. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the shelf, the one he hadn't touched since his fever. He uncorked it with his teeth, poured a long splash onto the bloody hole in his shoulder, and bellowed as the fire hit him. He wrapped a torn piece of sheet around it, a clumsy, useless bandage. He grabbed his coat. He couldn't feel his fingers. He stumbled out to the barn. His horse was gone. They'd taken it for Anna. Only the old mule was left. "All right, old man," he grunted, throwing a saddle on its back. "One last ride." He rode. He didn't ride for the courthouse. He rode for a small house on the edge of town, set back from the creek. He fell off the mule more than he dismounted, collapsing against the front door. It opened. A woman stood there, her hair in a long gray braid. She was tall, her face lined, her eyes the color of the prairie. Sarah Albright. "Silas?" she breathed, her eyes going wide. She had known him his whole life. She had been his mother's friend. She had been Wya's friend, too. "Silas Hart, my God!" She saw the blood, the ice in his beard. She didn't ask questions. She and her son, a quiet, strong man of 20, hauled him inside, laying him on the kitchen floor. "He's shot," she said, her voice calm. She sent her son for hot water and carbolic. "Who?" "Deputies," Silas grunted, his teeth clenched. They took her, Anna." "The woman," Sarah said. She had heard the rumors. She had dismissed them. She knew Silas. She cut the coat away. The wound was ugly, but the bullet had gone clean through. "You're lucky, Silas. It missed the bone." She packed it, her hands sure and strong. She poured hot coffee laced with brandy down his throat. I have to, he tried to sit up. You have to do nothing but bleed, for now, she said, pushing him back down. Wendell Cartwright, he has papers. He says she's his. I heard, she said quietly, her face grim. The preacher called an emergency council. They're at the courthouse now. They're calling it a hearing. It's a trial, Silas, and you're not there to speak. I lost Wea, he whispered, the brandy and the blood loss making him weak. I let them take her. Sarah, I wasn't there. Sarah Albright stopped her bandaging. She looked him in the eye, her gaze hard as flint. I loved Wea. She was my friend, and I'll tell you what she would have wanted. Silas looked away, ashamed. She would have wanted you to fight, Sarah said, her voice a fierce whisper. To fight for the living. She never wanted you to be a ghost. Silas, she never wanted you to build a tomb and lie down in it. She would have wanted you to get up and fight for this new girl. She tied the bandage, pulling it tight. Now, my son is saddling my horse. It's faster than that mule. You will ride to that courthouse, and you will raise your voice. You will do for this one what you couldn't do for her. She hauled him to his feet. Go, fight for the living. Silas Hart. The courthouse was just the town hall, a single large room packed with people. It was a spectacle. Reverend Gideon was at the front, his face flushed with righteousness. The councilmen sat at a long table, and at the front, on a hard bench, sat Anna, pale and trembling. Wendell Cartwright stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, a picture of smug protection. And so, the Reverend was saying, this council has a moral duty, to God and to decency. This man, Mr. Cartwright, has come all this way, with legal papers declaring this poor, lost soul, Anna Lee, to be mentally unfit, a ward of his. That's a lie, Anna cried, finding her voice. Silence, my dear, Wendell said, his fingers digging into her shoulder. You are unwell. It seems clear, the judge said, a weak-willed man named Peters, that she is hysterical. Mr. Cartwright's papers seem to be in order. The council votes to release her into his custody. No! The heavy oak doors of the hall banged open. The entire room turned. Silas Hart stood in the doorway. He was a vision from hell. He was caked in mud and half-frozen snow. His left arm was bound in a bloody, soaked bandage. His coat was torn, his face pale as death, but his eyes were burning. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Anna half rose from her seat, her hand flying to her mouth. Silas. Mr. Hart, the judge stammered, banging his gavel. This is a closed hearing. You are wounded. I am, Silas said, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. He walked forward. The crowd parted for him like he was a leper. He did not limp, though every step was agony. He walked right to the front, standing between Anna and the council. You're holding a trial, Silas said. You forgot to invite the defense. This is not a trial, Wendell snapped. This is a legal transfer of property. Deputies, remove this man. He's a criminal. He assaulted you. Deputy Sims, a fresh bandage on his own head, looked down, ashamed. He's got a point, Judge, the Reverend said. This man is a menace. I'll speak, Silas said, and I'll speak under oath. He stalked to the Bible on the judge's desk, put his good hand on it, and raised it. I, Silas Hart, swear to God, to tell the truth. The judge was too stunned to stop him. Silas turned. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the crowd, at Mrs. Miller, at the clerk, at the men who had whispered about him. You all know me, he said, his voice rough. You know what I lost. Some of you know why. A few men in the back looked away, their faces pale. You all think I'm a ghost, a savage, a man living in sin. He pointed a bloody finger at Wendell. You want to know about sin? You want to know what's morally unfit?" He looked at Anna. Her eyes were wide, pleading with him. "Don't!" He had to lift the blanket. "This man," Silas said, his voice ringing with authority, "did not come here to save a ward. He came to reclaim a victim. Back in St. Louis, he used his name, his money, and his fists, and he violated this woman." The room exploded in whispers. Anna let out a small, broken sob and covered her face. "He forced himself on her," Silas boomed, his voice breaking with a fury that was righteous. "And when she, a good, decent woman, refused to be silenced, refused to marry him to cover his crime, her own family, her father, threw her away, cast her out. This coward, he's not her guardian, he's her attacker." Wendell's face was purple. "Lies, slander. It's his word against mine. He's a half-breed lover, a known brute. And she's a known degenerate." "She is a good woman," Silas roared. "She is a kind woman. She came to my home, a home of grief, and she brought it back to life. She is not your property, Cartwright. She is not mentally unfit. She is just terrified of you." He turned, his whole body shaking with the effort, the blood starting to seep through his bandage again. He looked at Anna, and his voice, which had been a roar, dropped. It became a quiet, simple, devastating truth. He said it not to the crowd, but to her. "She's not his," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "She's mine." A gasp. The preacher looked triumphant. "A confession! He admits it!" "She's mine," Silas said again, louder, turning to the stunned council. "Not because of a piece of paper, not because of a bargain. She's mine because I love her." Silence. Absolute, profound silence. No one in that room had ever heard Silas Hart speak that word, love. It was a word that did not belong to him. Anna looked up, the tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking so hard she clasped them together. The judge stared, his mouth open. Wendell was sputtering. This is madness! It changes nothing! My papers are legal!" "He's right, Silas," Judge Peters said, finding his voice, though it was weak. "You're your feelings. They are not the law. Mr. Cartwright's guardianship papers, they are stamped by a court in Missouri." "Judge?" A new voice, a mousy, quiet man in the back. Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk. He was holding a ledger. "Judge Peters, sir," Abernathy said, stepping forward, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Mr. Cartwright's papers, they claim wardship over the unmarried woman, Anna Lee. Is that correct?" Yes, what of it?" Wendell snapped. "Well, sir," Abernathy said, opening the ledger. "She's not unmarried." Wendell froze. I beg your pardon," the judge said. "The mail order contract," Abernathy said, his voice gaining confidence. "The one Mr. Hart's brother filed. I thought it was just a proposal. But the circuit judge passed through last month. He reviewed the standing contracts, and he certified it, right here." He pointed to the book. "By proxy, and by her arrival and acceptance of shelter, the contract is binding. According to the laws of this territory, she is not Anna Lee. She is Mrs. Silas Hart." The room was silent. Then Sarah Albright, standing in the back, began to clap, slowly. Wendell looked at the judge. The judge looked at the ledger. He looked at Silas, bleeding but standing tall. He looked at Anna, who was now standing beside Silas, her hand on his good arm. "Mr. Cartwright," the judge said, clearing his throat. This changes the matter entirely. Your papers are for a person who does not legally exist. This woman is a married resident. Your wardship it's void." Wendell stared. He had been beaten. He had been beaten by a dead woman's friend, by a county clerk, and by a broken man who had just declared his love in front of the entire town. The crowd was murmuring. Their eyes were not on Anna as a sinner anymore. They were on Wendell. and they were full of cold, frontier judgment. Wendell looked at Anna, his face a mask of pure, reptilian hatred. He looked at Silas. He spat, a thick, ugly glob on the clean courthouse floor. "You can keep the ruined goods. Heart," he snarled, his voice low and vicious. "You two, you deserve each other. A savage and his—" "Get out," Silas said. Wendell saw the look in Silas's eyes. He saw the shift in the crowd. He had lost. He yanked his fine hat on, turned, and stormed out of the courthouse, shoving people out of his way. He left in a cloud of his own shame. The room was quiet. Reverend Gideon looked like he had swallowed a wasp. Silas stood, the strength that had held him up suddenly gone. He staggered. "Silas!" Anna cried, catching him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him up as his full weight sagged against her. "It's all right," he whispered, his head dropping to her shoulder. "I've got you." "No," she wept, holding him tighter, her tears soaking his bloody shirt. "I've got you." They rode back from town, not as a rancher and his burden, but as a husband and his wife. Silas was half delirious, slumped over the saddle of Sarah Albright's good mare, his arm bound tight, but his good hand never let go of the reins of Anna's horse. The townspeople had watched them go, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and a new, grudging respect. The story of the Hart Ranch was no longer a ghost story. It was a love story. It took a week for the fever from the wound to leave him. Anna tended to him, not with the frantic desperation of before, but with a quiet, steady ownership. She was his wife. This was her right. She changed his bandages. She spoon-fed him broth, and she sat by his bed, holding his hand, warding off the fever dreams that still, sometimes, made him call out. But this time, when he called out, it was for her. "Anna," he'd mutter. "Stay." "I'm here, Silas," she'd whisper, bathing his forehead. "I'm right here." As he healed, the land healed around them. The last of the stubborn snow melted away, and the prairie, which had been a frozen, dead gray, exploded into a riot of green. The air softened. It no longer tasted of iron and ice, but of damp earth, new grass, and the sweet scent of sage. One morning, Silas was well enough to sit on the porch steps, his arm in a sling, his face pale but his eyes clear. He watched Anna. She was on her knees by the fence line, near the spot where he had once told her nothing soft could grow. She was turning the soil with a small trowel. She had traded some of her hoarded flour with Sarah Albright for a handful of seeds. She was planting flowers, wild bluebells. He watched her, her head bent, her hands, still chapped but strong now, working the dark, rich earth. She was not asking for permission. She was claiming the land. She was putting down roots. He did not tell her they would die. He knew now that she was tougher than any frost. He still walked with a limp from where Wendell had struck him, a reminder of the fight. But his eyes, those flat, gray eyes, were no longer haunted. They were clear. They were present. He was mending a piece of harness on the porch, his good hand clumsy but determined. Anna sat beside him, shelling peas. The silence between them was no longer an armor. It was a comfort. "This house," he said, his voice low, not looking at her. It's small. It's a good, sturdy house. Silas," she said, her hands not stopping. "Aye," he said. "But it's just one room. When my PA built it—" He stopped. He cleared his throat. "I was thinking, that east wall. It gets the morning light. It'd be a good place to build another room." Anna's hands stilled in the bowl of peas. She looked at him. Another room? He kept his eyes on the leather strap in his lap. He mumbled it, so low she almost missed it, the words thick with a shy, terrifying hope. For children." Anna's breath caught. The peas in her lap blurred. She looked down, her heart swelling with a joy so profound it was almost indistinguishable from pain. Children. He was talking about a future, about a life. She set the bowl down, her hands trembling. She had to tell him. The last of her ghosts, the last of her shame. "Silas," she whispered. He heard the change in her voice and looked up, his new, clear eyes finding hers. "Wendell," she started, and her voice broke. The thing he did in St. Louis, it wasn't just it left a mark. The doctor, before I left, he told me—" She couldn't meet his gaze. She looked at her hands. "He told me that I might not be able to bear children, that the damage—" She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She had failed him. She was a barren wife. She had brought him a life, but she could not give him a new one. She waited for him to pull away, to go back inside his walls. Silas sat for a long, long moment. He looked at her bowed head, at the shame that was making her tremble. He saw the last of her St. Louis scars. He reached out his good hand, not to her face, not to her arm, but to her hands. He laid his large, warm, calloused hand over her two small, trembling ones. He just held them. "Anna," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears. "That doesn't mean you don't deserve warmth," he said. It was everything. It was forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was a promise that she was enough, that the life they had right now was enough. She didn't cry. She just held his hand and let the last of her ghosts drift away on the warm prairie wind. The house, which had been a tomb, began to fill with life. Sarah Albright came first. She rode up one Sunday with her son, carrying a fresh-baked apple pie. "Heard you were planting bluebells," she said to Anna, stepping over the threshold that had once been forbidden. "They'll spread. You'll have a whole field of them soon." They sat at the scrubbed table and drank coffee. Silas talked to Sarah's son about cattle prices, and Anna had a friend. Others followed. The story in the courthouse had done more than just free Anna. It had freed Silas. He was no longer the town pariah. He was the man who had faced down a rich, cruel Easterner. He was the man who had bled for his wife. He was, once again, a part of the world. They hosted Sunday suppers, the mercantile owner and his wife, even Deputy Sims. His head bowed in apology, came with a gift of fresh tobacco. Sarah brought over a piano. It was old, had belonged to Silas's mother, and had been stored in Sarah's barn for years. It was out of tune, but it was life. Anna, her hands rough and scarred, her fingers stiff, sat down and played. She played the simple hymns her mother had taught her. She played, and Silas sat in his chair, his eyes closed, and he listened. The house was not just a house. It was a home, the sound of quiet laughter, of books read aloud by the fire, of piano music. It filled the spaces where the grief had lived. One night, after a long, warm day of mending fences together, Anna took a bath. She used the good soap Sarah had brought, the one that smelled of lavender. She unbraided her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders, damp and clean. She came out of her alcove. The cot was still there, but she no longer slept in it. It was just a place to store her things. Silas was already in bed. The wound in his shoulder was healing, leaving a puckered, angry scar. He was reading a book by the light of the oil lamp. He looked up when she came out. She stood there, in her simple white nightdress, her hair loose. She was no longer a refugee. She was no longer a victim. She was beautiful. He looked at her, and his eyes, which had held so much pain, were full of a quiet, steady, and profound devotion. He didn't speak. He just smiled. A slow, warm, genuine smile. He lifted the blanket, and with his good hand, he tapped the sheet. Once, twice. She walked to him. She slipped under the blanket, into the warmth that was hers. He put his book aside and blew out the lamp. He turned to her, and she turned to him. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no grief clinging between them. There was no desperation. His hands were not shaking. They were sure. Her body was not stiff. It was soft. They lay together, skin to skin, in the warm, safe dark. It was not just need, it was not just comfort, it was devotion. It was the final, quiet, perfect mending of two souls. It was a promise kept. The light came early, as it always did. A pale golden light that spilled across the wooden floor. Anna woke first. She was curled against his side, his good arm thrown over her, holding her fast, even in sleep. She lay there, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing. She watched the light creep across the room, touching the bluebells she had put in a jar on the table. It touched his face. The lines of care and pain now softened in rest. The light fell across his shoulder, highlighting the new, raw scar that had bought her freedom. She felt a well of emotion so deep it almost choked her. All the nights she had lain cold on the floor, all the days she had worked until her hands bled, all the fear, all the loss, it had all led to this warmth, to this safety. She whispered the old question, the one that had haunted her from the first night. But it was not a question anymore. It was an answer. Where will I sleep? She smiled, a slow, secret smile. She gently tucked her head under his chin, fitting herself into his arms, into the space that was, and always would be, hers. A hawk circled high above the prairie, its shadow passing over the small cabin. The land, once so cruel and so cold, breathed warm again, because two people, broken by the world, had chosen to stay together. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please comment below and let us know where you're listening from so we can all connect. And don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more stories like this one.